So they asked me to put together a short presentation for the people taking part of the Adirondack Architectural Heritage Group. So this is where this program started. And we hired the town trolley and made several stops around the town, mainly focusing on mid-century design of the many cabin colonies and motels located here. And then Janet Null, she's an architect and the president of Argus Architectural and Preservation in Troy. And she was working on a field guide to Adirondack architecture. So between that and the Adirondack Architectural Heritage Group, this program evolved. So next, Jess. Lake George has a long history of visitors coming to the area. George Washington, along with Alexander Hamilton, made a tour of the northern battlefields, which included Lake George. In 1783, Thomas Jefferson wrote his now famous letter to his daughter saying that Lake George is the most beautiful waters he had ever seen. So historical context and tourism laid the foundation for the settlement of our area. Next. Cooper's Cave is the site of the fictional hiding place of Hawkeye and his companions. Cooper must have seen this place and wove it into his story in The Last of the Mohegans. And now the cave is part of the New York State's historic Independence Trail. And it's located along the Hudson River underneath the bridge, which connects South Glens Falls and Glens Falls. There's a viewing platform, which is open from May until the end of October. And this mural hangs in the lobby of the Queensbury Hotel. And the committee of local businessmen that developed the hotel commissioned Griffith Bailey Cole in 1926 to paint the mural for the hotel's opening. Next. When Thomas Cole and Cooper visited the area, neither artist or the writer intended to promote the lake or the region as a tourist destination. However, the works of Cole and Cooper instilled in the minds of the public the inspiration for including beauty and history to their summer destinations. And the scene Thomas Cole painted was in the book eventually of Cooper's Last of the Mohegans. Next. With the opening of the Plank Road in 1848, Lake George became more accessible to visitors than ever before. On a good day, as many as 50 coaches would pass through the toll booth. This is the toll booth number 2 at French Mountain, which is basically 149 and Route 9 now. The money that was collected from the tolls was used for the upkeep on the road. The toll for a horse from Glens Falls to Caldwell was 12 cents, 24 cents for a team. People who lived between the toll gates paid a flat yearly fee. And this toll gate was abandoned in 1904. Next. The halfway house. George Brown built the halfway house in 1846-47. He was known as a friendly proprietor who served fine food, venison, trout, and all other types of game. He put the inn on the map. And the halfway house was located pretty much where one of the shoe stores is on 9 and 149 on the west side of the road. Next. Caldwell's earliest accommodations provided rooms for the lumber drivers, traders, and laborers. As one old resident put it, the town lived on fish and strangers. It must have treated the strangers well as they became to come in increasing numbers as Lake George became famous as a summer resort. Next. The United States Hotel at Crosby-side was built in 1853 and had baths, bells, and a better view than the lake house on the western shore. The Crosby-side property changed hands several times. The Young Ladies Institute came next. Then, due to lack of pupils, Francis Crosby purchased the property and enlarged it and named it after himself, Crosby-side. In 1902, Spencer Trask purchased it and later gave the property to the Girls Friendly Society, and it eventually became what we now know as Weehawken. Fort William Henry Hotel was built in 1854, 1855, and had a commanding view of the lake to the north. The lake house on the west side of the shore, on the site of the current Shepherd Park, was actually the first hotel in the area. It was the house of village founder James Caldwell, whose son William converted it into an inn after the death of his father in 1829. Okay. After the central house burned in 1875, it was rebuilt into a new central house, and it became the site of the Arlington and Warden, and eventually the Lake George Hotel, which burned in a wildfire, and not a wildfire, it was a wildfire in 1978. The Fernwood property became Nordics and Scotty's Motel. The Carpenter House became the Mayrd Hotel. Next. This is a photo taken by Seneca Ray Stoddard. These St. Francis Indians from Canada would come down every summer, paddling down Lake Champlain and Lake George to set up camp. They sold their hand-woven baskets and souvenir birch bark canoes in hotel lobbies and aboard the steamboats. They also tested visitors in their skills at archery. Mohegan Street runs perpendicular to Canada, and it's basically the street. It is the street that runs up to Sacred Heart Church in the village here in Lake George. Next. The railroad came to Lake George. The Caldwell branch of the Glens Falls Railroad arrived at the head of the lake in 1882. And this is the first railroad station that was situated on the property. And it stayed there until 1911, when the next station was built, the station that's there today. Next. The ruins at Fort George became a tourist destination soon after the Revolutionary War, but it wasn't until nearly 100 years later that it became formally commemorated as a place of historical importance. From 1897 to 1900, the newly formed Society of Colonial Wars was able to convince New York State and the legislature to appropriate money to purchase the land for the Battleground Park from the Caldwell heirs. The Lake George Historical Association and then the New York State Historical Association became caretakers of the new park. it became the first intentionally designated historic location in the Adirondacks. The state continued to acquire land to add to the park up until the mid-1960s. It is now under the management of the Department of Environmental Conservation. And this spring, the year 2022, a new visitors interpretation center plans to open in the Lake George Park Commission building along the Fort George Road. Next. Thousands of people attended the unveiling of the Johnson Hendricks statue in September of 1903. That statue commemorated the battle, the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Lake George. Cavalry from Fort Ethan Allen came down from Vermont. They came aboard the train, and there were special excursion trains from New York City as well. In September of 1935, over 3,000 people attended the reburial of the 4 unknown soldiers displaced in 1931 during road work on the Glens Falls Lake George Road. Father Isaac Jogues' statue was dedicated in 1939, where again, thousands of spectators came to the event. And the Indian statue was installed and placed there in 1921. And last year was the 100th anniversary of the statue being there. Next. Train service opened the area to a wider audience. With the addition and the coming of Hudson Valley Electric Railway, people could come and visit in greater numbers. Trolley cars came from, the line was from Troy all the way to Warrensburg, and it lasted roughly 25, 27 years. Next. After the trolley closed, bus transportation to Caldwell and Lake George thrived throughout the Adirondacks through World War II and into the late 1940s. And once people started owning their own automobiles, travel by bus became less and less frequent. Next. World War II had ended, and with that began a new era of prosperity. The growing middle class sought out destinations with inexpensive places to stay. Places that offered shorter stays and the availability to visit both the natural wonders and the man-made amusements. Next. By car, Lake George is only a day's drive from most major metro areas. This postcard, old postcard, shows the view once seen by driving north on Route 9 towards the lake. The train track sits on the lower right. And I found a description from an Adirondack guidebook that said, "One suddenly breaks forth upon one of the most beautiful sights to be seen anywhere in this great country of ours. There, spread out below and in the distance is Lake George, that far-famed queen of American lakes, with its crystal waters amidst the majestic mountains, which rivals events the lakes of Scotland and Switzerland for beauty. It is a wonderful view from this vantage point, and one long to be remembered by the tourists who pass through here. Today, The road still goes that way, but the trees have grown up, so the view is hidden.
Where's that spot?
That spot is north of what is now Magic Forest, going north on Route 9. Next. Sisson's Court, built by Mr. Henry Sisson, was built in 1925. And this claimed to be the first motor court east of California. It burned in August of 1962, and it burned 12 of the 16 units. The Marriott Hotel sits on this site just south of Lake George High School. The one building left, and it's not there any longer. It stayed for a long time. It was the law office of, I can't think of who it was, Millington's law office, but no longer there. The Marriott Hotel sits there just south of Lake George High School. Next. I know it's kind of locking up there. All right, that's okay. All right. Oh, you went back. Okay. Cabin colonies. Yes. Visitors wanted places to stay and things to do. Many of the lakeside motels and cabins were built on land that formerly belonged to the great mansions of the late 1800s. In the 1950s, a week's vacation might cost $25. Next. This is from 1956. Along came a new idea from the Chamber of Commerce called the Self-Service Housing Bureau. It was basically an illuminated bulletin board, street maps, owners' names, phone numbers for people who hadn't made a reservation. They could, the phone booth was right next door, so they could call up and find out if there was a bed for rent. It was arranged by group, motels, cabins, dude ranches, and hotels. Represented over 14,000 beds for rent in 1956. Next. Many of these cabin colonies have since been torn down to make way for newer, larger accommodations. This property is now the site of the Quality Inn, which sits across the street from the Fort William Henry Hotel, right on Main Street in the village. Next. Yes. Thank you. In 1949, Governor Thomas E. Dewey broke ground for the $1 Million Beach, as it's called, and it opened in June of 1951. When it opened, it was called one of the finest developments in northern New York. The advertisement stated, "There is ample parking adjacent to the beach for automobiles and an underpass from the parking area, which permits people to go directly into the solarium, bathhouse, and beach without crossing the highway." When the beach was built, Warren County constructed a beautiful boulevard leading from the village to the new beach. The highway now is known as Beach Road, and it was built on filled land. Next. The Ticonderoga was originally built and constructed for the Navy in Bay City, Michigan. She was launched and commissioned in 1944. She sailed to Hawaii and the Philippines and carried men and supplies between Okinawa and Japan during the war. She returned to San Francisco and eventually to the East Coast. She was decommissioned in 1947 and sold to the Lake George Steamboat Company in 1949 for $11,000. The story of her getting here is a long one, and it's for another time, but she stayed in service until 1989, and during this time she carried thousands of passengers without incident. Okay, next. Jess and I are working off of 2 screens, and I appreciate her help, so thank you very much, Jess. Okay, a new enterprise and museum on Route 9, the Indian Museum, started by Sam Frost and his mother, Peggy McCandless. They would drive out west in the wintertime and look for Indian relics and items for interest. And the curator of the Indian Museum, Stanley Gifford, he was an archaeologist and historian. And he wrote several books on the history of Fort William Henry. So the teepee is still there. Indian Museum is long gone. Next. Now these buildings still exist in part and is now the spot where the leather outlet on Route 9 is, towards the southern town line, just north of Route 149 on Route 9. Next. The Adirondack Northway was coming north, and it was a controversial decision, but that's a topic for another talk as well. The interstate was built as part of Eisenhower's administration National Defense Initiative. Several routes were proposed, but the final decision, as we all know, was being made to follow the route north nearing Lake George. The Adirondack Northway was completed in 1969, and sadly, many of the businesses along Route 9 corridor closed as travelers stayed on the interstate, bypassing the earlier main route, which was Route 9 north. Next. So the Frosts opened the Tom Tom shop. The Frost family, Sam and his mother and wife, opened the Tom Tom shop in 1960. They realized that with the coming of the Northway, Route 9 would be forgotten almost, or bypassed. So they moved into the village of Lake George, and the Tom Tom shop is still there, still selling trinkets and jewelry. Next. Indian themed attractions were popular, and they evoked an historic sense of place. The Indian Village site was built to house 20 teepees with a tribe of 15 Indians from the St. Regis Reservation in northern New York. The museum looked to acquire specimens of history and relics which were on display. Inside the stockaded village was to be a pond for real birch bark canoes, as well as replicas of animals who roamed the forest in ancient times. Giant trees which stood inside the museum gave a realistic effect to the displays. 2 bark buildings, a burial ground, hunting traps, and tom-toms were added for local color. Many different tribes were represented, including Comanche, Seminole, Mohawk, Hopi, Micmac, and Kiowa. And this Indian Village was located across the street from where the elementary school is now on Route 9L. Next. From a 1952 news article, Indian Village was planned to be a monument to the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. It is believed that it will be a decided attraction for visitors to the area. Items acquired were the biggest canoe, the largest bow and arrow, and the world's greatest peace pipe. Chief Far Eagle will teach children Indian Sign Language, how to play the tom-tom, and how to throw a tomahawk. Of course, there will be a trading post where Indian-made goods will be sold as souvenirs. Fire consumed the Indian Village in March of 1959, and there were no plans to rebuild. Next. Fort William Henry is still here and it's restored. And the current structure is an interpretation of the original fort built on the footprint of the earlier 1755-57 fort. Guided tours with reenactors, musket ball molding, and cannon firing help visitors to experience life at the fort. And today the fort is open and they plan to be open in the winter. The museum is updated and they actually have ghost tours and haunted history tours. Next. Storytown. In 1954, Charlie Wood and his wife, Margaret, invested $75,000 in 5 acres on Route 9 between Lake George and Glens Falls, launching Storytown, USA. Next. Storytown predated Disney World by a year. From the first day it opened, it was a huge success. An early brochure for Storytown said, "Once upon a time, you were a child. Just like your own little boy or girl, you learned the Mother Goose rhymes by heart. What fun it would be to meet and play with all these happy creatures. Do you remember those wishes? You can make your child's wish come true. Today, you can take your child in a car to a place where you could only go in your dreams. The name of this place is Storytown, USA. Your visit will long be remembered as a golden moment. Do come soon." Next. Storytown was a childhood wonder. What could be more magical than seeing Cinderella and her pumpkin coach? Here, the fairy tales came to life. The old woman in the shoe, the little boy blue, 3 billy goats Gruff, the big bad wolf, and little Miss Muffet, all real and all within reach. Next. Charlie Wood added Ghost Town a few years after Storytown opened. He watched from the parking lot from the hill and saw that the men were hanging around smoking cigars in the parking lot. He then decided to create Ghost Town. As reported in the Adirondack Guidebook, here you visit the authentically furnished buildings such as grocery store, drugstore, barbershop, carriage sheds, and blacksmith shop. You may be stopped and deputized at a moment's notice, capture, sentence, or even kill the ornery gunslinging outlaws who keep the town jumping with bank holdups, jailbreaks, etc. In Ghost Town, we could ride on a replica ore train through the tunnels of chills and spills. At the end of the tunnel on Main Street, it contains a beautiful assortment of fluorescent minerals. In 1982, Charlie Wood changed the name of the park to the Great Escape and eventually selling to Six Flags. Next. Five years after founding Storytown, Wood again partnered with Arto Monaco to design the colorful village with storefront replicas. Yesterday's Fun Today was the musical theme advertisement. Gaslight entertained the evening crowds after Storytown closed for the day at 5:30. Next. What many people don't know, and I learned from the Adirondack Almanac, that Gaslight Village was briefly located at what is now Smoke Rise Campground in Pottersville, New York, about 25 miles to the north. Wood built Gaslight Village on the former Delaware and Hudson rail yard property. Next.
Which is now.
Among the featured ride assembled for the park were an 1800 merry-go-round, an 1825 bicycle ride by George Tilliou. He was the founder of Coney Island Steeplechase Park. The Green Monster, the Mexican Scrambler, Ferris wheel, shaving mug, bumper cars, the Paratrooper, and the classic dark ride Flight to Mars, which came to Gaslight Village by way of Palisades Park in Coney Island. Next. The Opera House could seat 1,000 people. Vaudeville acts and can-can shows took place no matter what the weather was. There was an ice review and a silent movie theater. Gaslight Village remained open until 1989, and there was a brief stint as Lake George Action Park. But after much debate, the site is now the Charles R. Wood Festival Space and Park, right here in the village, right next to the Battleground Park and near the beach. Charlie Wood, he was an entrepreneur extraordinaire. He built the Tiki Motor Lodge nearby Gaslight Village on Route 9, offering nightly entertainment for parents who had earlier in the day taken their kids to Storytown or Gaslight Village. He traveled extensively and decorated the lobby and lounge with Polynesian art and artifacts. Interest in exotic Polynesia was boosted by World War II vets returning from the Pacific Theater. And according to Janet Null, the architect who came to Lake George, the tiki architecture was most widely used in California and is quite rare in the Northeast. It was primarily used for restaurants and motels or hotels, the most famous of which was Disney's first theme hotel, the Polynesian at Disney World, which opened a decade after the Tiki Resort here in Lake George. Next. Christmas City opened in 1963. Arthur Gillette built his fairyland just south of Lake George Village. Christmas City was located on Route 9 and drew crowds from both Albany and New York City. He understood that children's eyes would light up seeing Santa, so he decided to create a place where Santa lived. Its motto was, Christmas City, a village of warmth and love, where on the warmest day you could find a cool breeze blowing pine needles to the ground. Santa's house and reindeer were all part of the design. Christmas City was open from May until October, and then from Thanksgiving until Christmas Eve. Next. In 1965, Gillette changed the name to Magic Forest and added an Indian village that same year. Indian Village claimed to have the only real live ceremonial Indian dances in the area. He eventually understood that children wanted amusement rides, so he began purchasing used kiddie rides from other defunct parks. Both he and his son Jack were expert mechanics, so fixing and repairing them took little effort. Over the years, Magic Forest went from 2 rides to 25. Interest in the Indian Village waned, so that part of the park eventually closed. The diving horse show, a horse diving exhibit, opened at Magic Forest in 1977, first starring Rex the diving horse for over 18 years, and later Thunder, then Lightning. The diving horses would walk up a ramp 9 feet off the ground and jump into a pool of water. Their trainers would reward them with a bucket of oats. The diving horse jumps twice daily, 2 months out of the year, and only during dry weather. The last of an era for the diving horses has come. However you feel about the act, Lightning, the diving horse, performed at Magic Forest for 24 years. In the summer of 2018, Lightning, now with a white face, refused to jump, and that was that. He remained at Magic Forest to pet and feed, but the diving show was no more. Now, Uncle Sam originally stood at the Danbury Fairgrounds, and he was at Magic Forest since 1982. Now he's back in Danbury, where he came from, Connecticut. Next. Yes. Next, there we go. Okay, thank you. From the 1950s to the 1970s, thousands of muffler men were made by the California company International Fiberglass. They were placed at businesses all over North America and were considered to be roadside attractions, especially along the famous Route 66. Hamburger shops, muffler repair shops, and roadside gift shops often had their own versions of the muffler man, but generally they looked like this. And Magic Forest had a lot of them, and recently had an auction selling off many of them, because now Magic Forest is the Lake George Expedition Park, Dino Roar Valley. Next. Yes. I think Jess is having an issue with her screen. No, here we go. Okay, thank you. Animal Land, Lake George. Host Peter Cottontail. He was a trained rabbit, and he personally took tickets from the young visitors here to see and pet more than 1,000 baby animals and birds. Among other activities of note were a duck derby with a featured race every hour and a baby chimpanzee show. Animal Land lived briefly as Lake George Zoological Park. It was located on Route 9 between Martha's Dandy Cream and Pirates Cove, down on Route 9, across from Storytown and the Great Escape. Storytown, which is now the Great Escape. Next. Animal Land is now closed for many years, and it sat across the road from Storytown. It has since been incorporated into the land owned by the Great Escape. Next. During the 1950s, veterans and their families frequented the drive-ins. It was inexpensive family entertainment. They could sit in their cars, eat, and let their children fall asleep in the back seat. Couples found privacy, no nosy seat neighbors. They could smoke, walk around, and have the outdoors right outside the car. In 1958, there were roughly 4,000 drive-in theaters in the country. Today, there's less than 400. And an interesting side note, they had the church services at the drive-in movie theaters, and the Beach Drive-In was located on 9L where the elementary school is today, and the Fort George Drive-In, the church drive-in services, that was where Waterslide World eventually bought that property. Next. Howard Johnson's. Their signature orange roof, weather vane, and cupola made it an unmistakable stop along the highway. The Simple Simon and the Pie Man was a logo created in the 1930s by artist John Alcott. The restaurant chain had its early beginnings in Massachusetts as a soda counter in a corner drugstore by Mr. Howard Johnson. Next. By 1954, there were 400 Howard Johnson's restaurants in 32 states, about 10% which were extremely profitable company-owned turnpike restaurants. The rest were franchises. Lake George Howard Johnson's was purchased by Carl DeSantis for $2,500 for his first franchise in 1953. His father had become familiar with the restaurant chain when in New Jersey and thought Lake George could support a Hojo's. After reading the prospectus, Carl convinced his dad to co-sign a loan and donate the land adjacent to the cabin colony the family owned. In the years that followed, he continued to open other Hojo's throughout the state. And remarkably, Lake George Hojo's was one of the 3 remaining, and eventually DeSantis Enterprises sold that site. Next. A&W is an American chain of fast food restaurants, distinguished by its burgers and draft root beer floats. And its origins date back to 1919 when Roy Allen set up a roadside drink stand to offer new thick and creamy drink root beer at a parade honoring returning World War I veterans in Lodi, California. Allen's employee Frank Wright partnered with him in 1922, and they founded their first restaurant in Sacramento, California in 1923. The company name was taken from the initials of their last name, Allen and Wright. Became famous in the United States for its frosty mugs, and they were kept in a freezer and filled with A&W root beer just before being served to customers. By 1960, A&W had 2,000 restaurants. And ours has been in Lake George since 1959. Next. Yonder Hill Golf Course was once a par 3, 9-hole golf course, complete with pro shop, equipment rentals, and a restaurant. Now this land is home sites for a number of houses, and the clubhouse is the town of Lake George offices. Next. In 1925, George Foster Peabody deeded to the state of New York some 400 acres of land atop Prospect Mountain with a 100-foot right-of-way from the village of Lake George. The effort to construct a paved highway to the top of the mountain took many years and many advocates to accomplish. Construction began in 1966 and took 2 years to complete. And it's still a major attraction when people. Next. Operating from the late spring through the fall, the park advertised, "It's a park where history, past, present, and future come alive." From the exciting space age dynadomes, the simulated moonwalk, and the fully equipped observatory, to the authentic Iron Horse Railroad, the antique car rides, and many other fascinating attractions. Timetown is a new world of learning fun. And Timetown had a problem in that it was located off the beaten track. It was hard to get there up on Coolidge Hill Road between Lake George and Bolton Landing, up on the hill. Next. It was a time travel theme park, and it operated from 1970 to 1981. And one of the most popular attractions at Timetown was the Flying Saucer trip to the space age future. It was a collaboration between the park's creator, Ted Yund, and artist Jean Mundell. From a 1973 article about the park, it said, "Visitors enter a teleportation room where they are prepared for their planetary trip. After that, it's on to the planet where eerie landscapes, lighting, and weird audio effects accompany such sights as a fallen spaceship still emitting its last flickering light." And the park closed in 1981. Next. Wax Life opened in 1971 and was open until the mid-1980s. It was another Charlie Wood venture, and it was across the street from where Gaslight Village sat, along Westbrook Road, which is now Betty Little Boulevard. It eventually closed and was converted into Charlie's Saloon, which lasted a few years. And today the property is incorporated into the Charles R. Wood Environmental Park. Next. This was also Mr. Wood's enthusiastic collection. His car collection included the 1933 Duesenberg, once owned by Greta Garbo, later sold to a Texan for $1.4 million. And Wood donated $1 million of the proceeds to the Hyde collection in Glens Falls. Other pieces in the collection included 3 large movie model ships from the movie Tora, 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 and a car shaped painted like a can of V8 juice, and the Evel Knievel motorcycle, and the Chitty Chitty Bang Bang movie car. And that was also at Gaslight Village property. Next. The House of Frankenstein. Pre-recorded screams fill your ears. Dummies are flayed alive, garroted, and boiled in oil. A skull sticks out of a pile of sand. Ant torture, 1,000 deaths before the end, reads the sign. A woman screams as an axe cleaves into her face. The Hatchet Man. Another innocent victim is murdered. Other favorites among the 52 exhibits were an electrocution, where you throw the switch, the man of the future who looks like the Colossus of New York with flashing red eyes. Another room that called the Strange Planet, where you walk across wrestling mats while early Pink Floyd echoes through you. And finally, your host, a strange, deformed figure that babbles Ed Wood-esque dialogue. The fall and fabric of your existence is but a trickle in the sands of time. Whew. Next. And the House Frankenstein is still in operation. Shell World, Arthur Jones opened the store in 1963, and he operated as a gift shop on Canada Street. And it's a boat dealership, I believe, but it's across the street from the Fort William Henry. It was there for 5 years. It was first a coffee shop and then a gift shop before turning it into a shell shop. He also created Goonie Golf, and he moved his location to the corner of 9 and 9N, Gift World and Goonie Golf. Next. Sitting on the corner of Route 9 and 9L, Waterside World purchased the Konsikowski family purchased it, the same location. They purchased the Fort George Drive-In movie theater and built Waterside World. And it was open during the summer season for nearly 40 years. Next. Miniature golf is a popular roadside attraction all over the United States. Lake George has a history of inventive, amusing miniature golf courses. The first course was built by the Parrott family in 1929 on the corner of Beach Road and Canada Street.
First course in the world.
The original owner, George Parrott, operated summers in Lake George. And when the season ended, he rolled up the felt greens and took them to Florida along with his props. And he operated his miniature golf all winter down there. It remained on the corner for many years, and now is the location where the carousel and the bumper boats are located, down on that corner. Next. Goonie Golf was created by Arthur Jones of Shell World, and he opened it in 1972. This summer, be celebrating 50 years in business. Next. Today, this is one of the oldest and most original mini golf courses in the region. It was designed by the late Harry Horn, and it was inspired by his world travels. He set out to create a fun and interesting amusement for the entire family. The rickshaw on one of the round the world holes is one of the additions that he purchased on a travel to Thailand. Next. Paul Bunyan resides over one of the courses, one of the holes, I should say, around the world. And he was a muffler man, and he originally came from the Oregon State exhibit at the 1964 World's Fair held in New York City or Long Island. Next. Now this site around the world has 2 courses, around the world and around the USA. Still operating from in the summer, spring to fall. Next. the pink roof, that was also Harry Horn's business venture, actually predates Around the World Miniature Golf by a couple of years. It was opened in 1961 and still there 60 years later. Next. So thank you all for joining me for my talk. I want to thank the Adirondack Almanac, where I found a lot of information, Lake George Mirror, newspapers.com, and the Abandoned Carousel. That's an interesting site, lots of information on that. So thank you all. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much, Margy.
Oh, you're welcome.
Now, everyone, you can unmute if you have questions that you would like to ask. There were a couple of things in the chat that I saw. So someone asked a question about where were the tracks to Warrensburg? So maybe that was when we were talking about the train that went up to Warrensburg, or the
Yes.
trolley, perhaps.
The trolley went right up through Main Street, Lake George, came all the way from Glens Falls. It was an electric trolley, and the route it took through the village was up past Shepherd Park, and then it made a left on Amherst Street, and then a right, basically behind what is now the Lake George High School football fields,
Okay.
and up through past the town hall. And then you can, if you're driving to Warrensburg, you can see the trolley line on the left as you're driving north. It's kind of a flat area, and the terminus was in Warrensburg.
Then someone asked, one of the photographs towards the beginning of your presentation showed a group of Native Americans, and that was when they were selling their wares, a postcard. And someone said, are the Native Americans wearing masks in that photo? So that was near the beginning of your presentation.
Yeah, that's right, in the beginning. I'm not sure which slide it was. It was a Stoddard photo. Let me look.
They wondered if they were wearing masks. Didn't look like it.
No, I don't think so.
Okay. And then just some comments about there, seemed to be quite a few Indian villages there for a while, right?
I know, it was
Really
a
the
it
trend,
was a fascination. Well, I do know from a conversation, I guess, with Dorothy Frost, Sam Frost's wife. She said that they would go out in the winters and find out west and look for artifacts and Indian relics and jewelry and things to bring back to sell in Lake George. So I'm not sure what the fascination was at that time, but there was in the 50s, I'd say, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's when, kids were playing cowboys and Indians, right? And, Westerns were a rage. And so it makes sense. But
It
if
does
you
make
have
sense.
any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask them.
There you go. There you go.
I see one from Seth Harris. When did Prospect Mountain, where to go? The ski area operated. I'm not sure of the exact dates, but it was probably the late 30s for a couple of years. And then the Depression hit and the war hit and interest waned and lack of snow. So it probably operated about 10, 15 years. Somebody might know a little more than I do about that.
Thank you.
Margy,
Yes.
Hughes has a question for you.
Okay. Hi, Hugh.
In the beginning of your presentation, Mark, you talked about plank roads.
Yes.
I know plank roads were pretty much exclusive to Canada and the Northeast United States, and they were used in precursors to the turnpike to give easy access to spots like Lake George and things. You know, somebody owned those plank roads. They built from Lake George up, or you know, if they were built from Canada down.
They were toll roads, definitely.
Yes.
And I think there was a company, like the Glens Falls Lake George Plank Road Company. And I'm not exactly sure, but I'll get back to you on that.
Okay.
Great presentation, Mara.
Yeah, fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody, for coming. It's my first foray into the Zoom presentation mode. I've been on a lot of Zoom presentations, but never been the presenter. So it's something new and different. And
Hey, Margie.
Very much.
oh, hey, Melissa.
I'm sorry I missed it. Ah.
That's all right.
But
Just
did you record
recording
it?
it.
Yes,
good.
yes, we're still recording, so you'll be able to catch any parts that you missed.
Excellent.
Great.
I just got home.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us. We'll make sure that that's available so that you can see it too.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Margie.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Margy. It was so interesting, and especially for people who are newcomers to the area to know a little bit more about the history of this area that we love so much. It was really great for me to learn a little bit, more about where we live. So I really appreciate
Yeah,
it.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Oh, and
I
Seth's got a vote
appreciate
here
it.
for you to do more talks. So you said,
Yeah. Mhm.
so interesting and right in our backyard. You should do this as a regular series. I wholeheartely agree.
Yeah.
Different themes
Yeah.
each month. We'll talk, Margie. But I absolutely loved it. So thank you.
I'm glad. Thank you.
Thank you for
Margie,
the
it's
trip
it's
down memory
Roberta.
lane. Brought back a lot of memories.
Yeah, I know. Me too. It's been fun working on it, and it's been on my computer for several years. And every now and again I hit on it. But when I offered to do a presentation for our library, because I am the president of the library board of trustees, I thought I should do this. So
Well,
I did.
we are so glad that you did. We are so
Thank
glad
you.
that you did. Thank you.
Thanks. And Jess, thank you for your help. Really appreciate it. Couldn't have done it without you.
Oh yeah, well, I'm happy to do it. And I think it would be a really fun idea to do something again in the future for sure.
All right.
And along those lines, hi, this is Roberta. You mentioned something about maybe a program on the Northway being built. I think that would be an amazing project and very informative. My family house had to get moved because the Northway was going right through where it was. So I love hearing stories about how the Northway was put in.
Well, there is a huge file of clippings, and they're not attached to anything up at the town hall. And whoever was historian at the time in the 1960s clipped every article. And it really was a major deal because it was controversial, and certain business people wanted it to go certain ways, and they fought over it. And eventually, from what I understand, they figured it out. The engineers figured it out, how much earth would have to be moved in whatever direction. But in my mind, I kind of wish it hadn't been built right next to Lake George, but that's a topic for another time.
David.
So
I agree. I do agree, though. I would like to hear more about that as well, because obviously our family home, or and then moving that house, the big house, Judge Dyer moving it too, had to have been kind of an interesting project.
If I can get mom and dad's old 8mm film projector working, they have a movie of the house being moved.
Oh, really? That would be so cool.
If
That would
I
be
can get the
good.
projector working. That's a big if.
And
Yeah, can you
Gretchen,
transfer that to digital?
I probably could. I'd have to figure out which one it was. They probably have, I have about 30 or 40 films in my house that I took out of their house, and not all are marked.
Of course.
that's interesting. And Cindy, Gretchen recently found a photo of that house being moved.
Oh, cool.
I know, so
Have to send it.
yes,
Ah,
I don't see Gretchen.
she was on there.
Okay.
she might have left. We're down to one screen.
Yeah,
Yeah,
well,
she
thanks,
did.
Thank
everybody.
Yeah,
you very,
thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you
Margie.
so much,
Yeah.
Margie, for a
You're
wonderful
welcome.
presentation.
Well,
And
I'm
thank you
glad
everyone for
everybody enjoyed it.
coming.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Awesome.
Thanks,
We'll
Margie.
have
Good to
Yeah,
see
good
you.